Hey guys, tonight we step into a world bathed in a light that never fades, a place where the sun refuses to set and the days stretch on forever. Imagine yourself trekking across a rugged Icelandic landscape where jagged mountains rise like ancient giants and glaciers sparkle like shards of glass under a sun that hangs low, refusing to disappear beyond the horizon. It's midnight by the clock, but there's no darkness, only a shimmering golden glow washing over everything, painting the earth in hues of amber and honey. The shadows are long and restless, dancing as if caught in an eternal waltz with the light. This is the midnight sun, a surreal spectacle where night is an alien concept and time itself seems to slip its usual grip. You probably think living in endless daylight sounds like a dream, summer days stretching into forever. Endless hours to explore and enjoy. But take a moment and really imagine what that means. How do you sleep when the sun floods your bedroom at midnight? How do your eyes find rest when the world outside refuses to dim? For those early Viking settlers, this wasn't just a curiosity, it was a challenge that shaped their very existence. Before you settle in, do me a favor, pause for a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from as we journey into the heart of Iceland's luminous mystery. Now dim the lights around you. Maybe turn on a fan to create that soft, soothing hum. And let's begin to unravel the story of how the midnight sun shaped Viking culture. Picture yourself stepping onto this strange, glowing land centuries ago. As the first Vikings arrive after braving tempestuous seas and unknown waters. They are a hardy people, seafarers and warriors who thrive on challenge and adventure. Yet nothing could have prepared them for this strange new world where the sun didn't obey the usual rules. As they arrived on this volcanic island in the late 9th and 10th centuries, they stepped into a world where day merged seamlessly into night, where time itself seemed to lose its meaning. The sun, which once rose and set in predictable patterns, now hovered over them, casting light on everything and never resting. This constant daylight posed challenges that they had never encountered before. Life had always followed the rhythms of night and day. The Vikings were accustomed to the ebb and flow of time dictated by the rise and fall of the sun. But now, in Iceland, there was no fall of night to bring a sense of closure, no darkness to signal rest. Their internal clocks, perfectly attuned to the regularity of the world they had known, were suddenly thrown off balance. For many of them, this new world must have felt like a bizarre dream. How could you sleep when the sun was so bright, so relentless? How could you tell if time was passing when the light never changed? These questions must have haunted them as they adapted to life under the endless glow. The sagas tell us about the harsh winters they endured and the ever-present daylight that beckoned them into more work, more battle, more exploration. And yet, this endless day was not always a friend. It pushed them to find new ways of living, creating rituals to mimic the night, and eventually reshaping their culture in the process. Historians still debate whether this was a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, the endless light gave them more hours to hunt, fish, farm, and build. The short Icelandic summer was precious, and the midnight sun extended its reach, allowing them to make the most of the limited growing season. On the other hand, the absence of night brought fatigue, insomnia, and a mental strain that is hard for us to imagine. Sleep was fragmented, and the mind struggled to find rest. But the Vikings were not just survivors, they were adapters and innovators. They found ways to wrestle back some sense of normalcy. They crafted rituals, built darkened chambers, lit fires to mimic the night, and developed customs that helped them mark time in this unending day. The midnight sun was not just a natural phenomenon. It became woven into their culture, their stories, their beliefs. As you walk alongside them through this sunlit world, you realize the light itself became a character in their saga. It shaped their gods and myths. Balder, the radiant god of light and purity, gained new layers of meaning in this land of eternal day. The sun was sacred, powerful, sometimes even frightening in its unyielding presence. You hear the crackle of firewood in the longhouse as families gather beneath low wooden beams. Outside, the golden light pours through small windows, illuminating faces etched with weariness and wonder. They tell tales of heroism and tragedy, of gods who commanded the skies, and of battles fought under the watchful eye of the never-setting sun. The very fabric of their lives' work, rest, worship was woven with threads of light and shadow that defied ordinary understanding. As you stand there with them, under the endless glow, you realize the midnight sun was not just a backdrop but a living, breathing presence in their world. It shaped their spirits, their stories, and their struggles. Iceland was not just a place they lived in, it was a place that shaped them. And now, it's your turn to uncover the secrets of this luminous land and the people who thrived within its glow. Living without night, imagine it. The Earth's natural rhythm, so fundamental to all life, is suddenly shattered. Most creatures, including humans, are bound to a 24-hour cycle known as the circadian rhythm, a biological clock synchronized to the rising and setting of the sun. This clock regulates sleep, hormone production, body temperature, and countless other vital processes. Darkness signals rest, light signals activity. But here, on the northern edge of the world, that clock runs wild. For the Vikings who settled Iceland around 874 AD, this disruption was profound. Their ancestors in Norway and Denmark experienced long days and nights, but Iceland's extreme latitude meant weeks of sunlight without pause during summer. For someone used to the predictability of nightfall, this was bewildering. Sleep became elusive. The body's natural melatonin production, which peaks in darkness to induce sleepiness, was suppressed. Restlessness grew. Some Viking sagas hint at these struggles, describing weariness, irritability, and a feeling of being unmoored from time. Without night's embrace, the mind's usual resets were denied, leading to mental and physical fatigue. To cope, the Vikings developed ingenious methods to simulate darkness. Thick wool curtains were hung at windows, heavy tapestries dampened light inside their longhouses, and fires burned low to create pockets of warmth and shadow. These man-made nights offered temporary relief from the relentless sun, moments to calm the spirit and gather strength. Beyond these physical measures, rituals took on new significance. The Vikings' lives were deeply tied to cycles, seasons, harvests, hunts, and the absence of natural night necessitated symbolic markers. Festivals and ceremonies punctuated the endless day, providing a psychological anchor. These gatherings not only fostered community but also offered a sense of time passing, a way to measure life when the sun refused to set. In these rituals, the Vikings connected to their gods. Balder, the god of light, purity, and rebirth, was especially revered. His myths, steeped in themes of death and renewal, mirrored the tension between light and darkness in the Viking world. Stories of Balder's death brought a kind of hope, the promise that darkness and suffering would eventually give way to light again, a powerful metaphor for the cycles they lived through. You can imagine the flicker of torchlight during these ceremonies, the rhythmic chants echoing in the longhouses, the solemn faces illuminated by fire and moonless sky. These moments were sacred, a pause in the endless day where the Vikings found meaning and peace. Life in the endless light also influenced practical matters. Farming, for instance, benefited from the prolonged daylight. Iceland's short growing season was precious, and the midnight sun gave crops extra hours to mature. Barley, hay, and root vegetables grew under the glow, feeding communities through harsh winters. Farmers worked from dawn until well past midnight, using every minute of light to tend fields and livestock. But the midnight sun was not without its threats. The harsh Icelandic climate still demanded respect. Sudden storms, volcanic eruptions, and icy winds reminded the Vikings that the land was wild and untamable. The sun's light did not guarantee warmth or safety. It merely illuminated the challenges they faced. Hunters and fishers took advantage of the long days to extend their efforts. Fishing boats stayed out late, nets hauled under golden skies. Reindeer and other game were pursued across the glowing tundra. The extended hours were vital to survival, especially as the long winter months approached with their unyielding darkness and cold. Yet the contrast between endless light and deep winter darkness created a cyclical tension that permeated Viking life. They adapted to extremes. Endless day gave way to endless night. Each season demanded different strategies, different rituals, and different stories. You, walking among them, sensed the resilience required. It was a life of balance, where the sun was both friend and foe, a giver of life, and a source of exhaustion. The Vikings did not merely endure this world, they embraced it, weaving the midnight sun into the very core of their culture. Consider the psychological impact. Modern science has shown that disrupted circadian rhythms can cause mood swings, anxiety, and cognitive impairment. The Vikings had no such scientific understanding, yet their folklore and sagas reveal a deep awareness of the mind's fragile balance under such conditions. Stories speak of restless nights, visions and dreams stirred by the unnatural light. To soothe their spirits, the Vikings turned inward. Storytelling became a lifeline, a way to pass time, connect generations, and make sense of the world. The glowing skies seemed to stretch endlessly, but the tales they shared brought structure and comfort. Heroic epics, myths of gods and monsters, and recounting of ancestral deeds grounded them, reminding them of their place in a larger cosmic order. Imagine sitting in a smoky longhouse, the air thick with the scent of burning peat and roasted meat. Around you, voices rise and fall as elders recount the adventures of Odin, Thor, and Freya. The flickering fire casts shadows that dance against the wooden walls, mimicking the shifting light outside. This storytelling was not mere entertainment, it was a sacred act, a ritual that sustained the soul amid the sun's ceaseless gaze. And yet, the Vikings did not live in fear of the light. Far from it. The midnight sun was awe-inspiring, a symbol of endurance and strength. They named it Solarios, the sunlight, a powerful force that could both nurture and challenge. Their poems and songs celebrated the sun's life-giving power, its golden touch that warmed the earth and fueled their survival. The Vikings' understanding of the midnight sun influenced their calendar and timekeeping. Without a natural night, they divided days by activities, rituals, and community events. They marked time with the position of the sun, the length of shadows, and the phases of the moon during winter months. This flexible approach to time reflected their adaptability and intimate relationship with nature's rhythms. You might think such a world, dominated by an unsetting sun, would feel monotonous. But it was anything but. The light's quality changed through the day, from soft and pale in early morning to vibrant and golden at midday, then mellow and fiery as midnight approached. This subtle dance of light gave texture and mood to each moment, inspiring awe and reverence. The Vikings lived with this light not as passive observers, but as participants in its cycle. They built their lives around it, from farming schedules to religious ceremonies. The sun was a companion, a guide, and sometimes a challenge to be met. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself walking beside those early settlers, feeling the warmth of the midnight sun on your skin, hearing the crackle of firewood, and sensing the hum of a world where light never dies. Their story is one of resilience, adaptation, and the profound ways nature shapes culture. Living in the endless daylight of Iceland was no easy task. It demanded courage, creativity, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. But it also gave the Vikings a unique perspective, a chance to live in a world where time bent, light ruled, and the line between day and night vanished into a golden horizon. And that, my friend, is just the beginning of our journey through the midnight sun and the Viking spirit it forged. Iceland, a land of extremes, invites you into its wild beauty. The landscape stretches out before you, as if carved from the very bones of the earth itself. Majestic glaciers rise like frozen giants, their white-blue surfaces reflecting the sun's eternal light, while volcanic mountains, blackened by centuries of eruptions, jut out from the earth, raw and untamed. This rugged terrain is set against an endless horizon, where the midnight sun bathes everything in a glow that never fades. It's a land of contrasts, fire and ice, light and dark, harshness and beauty. And at its heart lies the very thing that made Iceland's early settlers, those audacious Vikings, rethink everything they knew about life: the midnight sun. The natural beauty of Iceland is undeniable, but the geography here has something more to offer. It's not just a place of striking landscapes and incredible wildlife. Iceland's location at the edge of the Arctic Circle brings with it a unique phenomenon: weeks of continuous daylight during the summer. The sun circles the sky, never dipping below the horizon, casting a glow across the land that lasts for what feels like forever. The skies seem to stretch endlessly, and you can't help but wonder how such a sight must have felt to those who first laid eyes on it. For the Vikings who sailed across the harsh seas to settle in Iceland, this was no ordinary sight. They were people who had navigated the world's oceans with fierce determination, but nothing could have prepared them for this strange new world, where the sun didn't obey the usual rules. As they arrived on this volcanic island in the late 9th and 10th centuries, they stepped into a world where day merged seamlessly into night, where time itself seemed to lose its meaning. The sun, which once rose and set in predictable patterns, now hovered over them, casting light on everything and never resting. This constant daylight posed challenges that they had never encountered before. Life had always followed the rhythms of night and day. The Vikings were accustomed to the ebb and flow of time dictated by the rise and fall of the sun. But now, in Iceland, there was no fall of night to bring a sense of closure, no darkness to signal rest. Their internal clocks, perfectly attuned to the regularity of the world they had known, were suddenly thrown off balance. For many of them, this new world must have felt like a bizarre dream. How could you sleep when the sun was so bright, so relentless? How could you tell if time was passing when the light never changed? These questions must have haunted them as they adapted to life under the endless glow. The sagas tell us about the harsh winters they endured and the ever-present daylight that beckoned them into more work, more battle, more exploration. And yet this endless day was not always a friend. It pushed them to find new ways of living, creating rituals to mimic the night, and eventually reshaping their culture in the process. Historians still debate whether this was a blessing or a curse. On the one hand, the endless light gave them more hours to hunt, fish, farm, and build. The short Icelandic summer was precious, and the midnight sun extended its reach, allowing them to make the most of the limited growing season. On the other hand, the absence of night brought fatigue, insomnia, and a mental strain that is hard for us to imagine. Sleep was fragmented, and the mind struggled to find rest. But the Vikings were not just survivors, they were adapters and innovators. They found ways to wrestle back some sense of normalcy. They crafted rituals, built darkened chambers, lit fires to mimic the night, and developed customs that helped them mark time in this unending day. The midnight sun was not just a natural phenomenon. It became woven into their culture, their stories, their beliefs. As you walk alongside them through this sunlit world, you realize the light itself became a character in their saga. It shaped their gods and myths. Balder, the radiant god of light and purity, gained new layers of meaning in this land of eternal day. The sun was sacred, powerful, sometimes even frightening in its unyielding presence. You hear the crackle of firewood in the longhouse as families gather beneath low wooden beams. Outside, the golden light pours through small windows, illuminating faces etched with weariness and wonder. They tell tales of heroism and tragedy, of gods who commanded the skies, and of battles fought under the watchful eye of the never-setting sun, the very fabric of their lives' work. Rest. Worship was woven with threads of light and shadow that defied ordinary understanding. As you stand there with them, under the endless glow, you realize the midnight sun was not just a backdrop, but a living, breathing presence in their world. It shaped their spirits, their stories, and their struggles. Iceland was not just a place they lived in, it was a place that shaped them. And now, it's your turn to uncover the secrets of this luminous land and the people who thrived within its glow. Living without night, imagine it. The Earth's natural rhythm, so fundamental to all life, is suddenly shattered. Most creatures, including humans, are bound to a 24-hour cycle known as the circadian rhythm, a biological clock synchronized to the rising and setting of the sun. This clock regulates sleep, hormone production, body temperature, and countless other vital processes. Darkness signals rest, light signals activity. But here, on the northern edge of the world, that clock runs wild for the Vikings who settled Iceland around 874 AD. This disruption was profound. Their ancestors in Norway and Denmark experienced long days and nights. But Iceland's extreme latitude meant weeks of sunlight without pause during summer. For someone used to the predictability of nightfall, this was bewildering. Sleep became elusive. The body's natural melatonin production, which peaks in darkness to induce sleepiness, was suppressed. Restlessness grew. Some Viking sagas hint at these struggles, describing weariness, irritability, and a feeling of being unmoored from time. Without night's embrace, the mind's usual resets were denied, leading to mental and physical fatigue. To cope, the Vikings developed ingenious methods to simulate darkness. Thick wool curtains were hung at windows, heavy tapestries dampened light inside their longhouses, and fires burned low to create pockets of warmth and shadow. These man-made nights offered temporary relief from the relentless sun, moments to calm the spirit and gather strength. Beyond these physical measures, rituals took on new significance. The Vikings' lives were deeply tied to cycles, seasons, harvests, hunts, and the absence of natural night necessitated symbolic markers. Festivals and ceremonies punctuated the endless day, providing a psychological anchor. These gatherings not only fostered community but also offered a sense of time passing, a way to measure life when the sun refused to set. In these rituals, the Vikings connected to their gods. Balder, the god of light, purity, and rebirth, was especially revered. His myths, steeped in themes of death and renewal, mirrored the tension between light and darkness in the Viking world. Stories of Baldur's death brought a kind of hope, the promise that darkness and suffering would eventually give way to light again, a powerful metaphor for the cycles they lived through. You can imagine the flicker of torchlight during these ceremonies, the rhythmic chants echoing in the longhouses, the solemn faces illuminated by fire and moonless sky. These moments were sacred, a pause in the endless day where the Vikings found meaning and peace. Life in the endless light also influenced practical matters. Farming, for instance, benefited from the prolonged daylight. Iceland's short growing season was precious, and the midnight sun gave crops extra hours to mature. Barley, hay, and root vegetables grew under the glow, feeding communities through harsh winters. Farmers worked from dawn until well past midnight, using every minute of light to tend fields and livestock. But the midnight sun was not without its threats. The harsh Icelandic climate still demanded respect. Sudden storms, volcanic eruptions, and icy winds reminded the Vikings that the land was wild and untamable. The sun's light did not guarantee warmth or safety. It merely illuminated the challenges they faced. Hunters and fishers took advantage of the long days to extend their efforts. Fishing boats stayed out late, nets hauled under golden skies. Reindeer and other game were pursued across the glowing tundra. The extended hours were vital to survival, especially as the long winter months approached with their unyielding darkness and cold. Yet the contrast between endless light and deep winter darkness created a cyclical tension that permeated Viking life. They adapted to extremes. Endless day gave way to endless night. Each season demanded different strategies, different rituals, and different stories. You, walking among them, sensed the resilience required. It was a life of balance, where the sun was both friend and foe, a giver of life and a source of exhaustion. The Vikings did not merely endure this world, they embraced it, weaving the midnight sun into the very core of their culture. Consider the psychological impact. Modern science has shown that disrupted circadian rhythms can cause mood swings, anxiety, and cognitive impairment. The Vikings had no such scientific understanding, yet their folklore and sagas reveal a deep awareness of the mind's fragile balance under such conditions. Stories speak of restless nights, visions, and dreams stirred by the unnatural light. To soothe their spirits, the Vikings turned inward. Storytelling became a lifeline, a way to pass time, connect generations, and make sense of the world. The glowing skies seemed to stretch endlessly, but the tales they shared brought structure and comfort, heroic epics, myths of gods and monsters, and recounting of ancestral deeds grounded them, reminding them of their place in a larger cosmic order. Imagine sitting in a smoky longhouse, the air thick with the scent of burning peat and roasted meat. Around you, voices rise and fall as elders recount the adventures of Odin, Thor, and Freya. The flickering fire casts shadows that dance against the wooden walls, mimicking the shifting light outside. This storytelling was not mere entertainment, it was a sacred act, a ritual that sustained the soul amid the sun's ceaseless gaze. And yet, the Vikings did not live in fear of the light. Far from it, the midnight sun was awe-inspiring, a symbol of endurance and strength. They named it Solarljós, the sunlight, a powerful force that could both nurture and challenge. Their poems and songs celebrated the sun's life-giving power, its golden touch that warmed the earth and fueled their survival. The Vikings' understanding of the midnight sun influenced their calendar and timekeeping. Without a natural night, they divided days by activities, rituals, and community events. They marked time with the position of the sun, the length of shadows, and the phases of the moon during winter months. This flexible approach to time reflected their adaptability and intimate relationship with nature's rhythms. You might think such a world dominated by an unsetting sun would feel monotonous, but it was anything but. The light's quality changed through the day from soft and pale in early morning to vibrant and golden at midday, then mellow and fiery as midnight approached. This subtle dance of light gave texture and mood to each moment, inspiring awe and reverence. The Vikings lived with this light not as passive observers but as participants in its cycle. They built their lives around it, from farming schedules to religious ceremonies. The sun was a companion, a guide, and sometimes a challenge to be met. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself walking beside those early settlers, feeling the warmth of the midnight sun on your skin, hearing the crackle of firewood, and sensing the hum of a world where light never dies. Their story is one of resilience, adaptation, and the profound ways nature shapes culture. Living in the endless daylight of Iceland was no easy task. It demanded courage, creativity, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. But it also gave the Vikings a unique perspective, a chance to live in a world where time bent, light ruled, and the line between day and night vanished into a golden horizon. And that, my friend, is just the beginning of our journey through the midnight sun and the Viking spirit it forged. Now that you've been immersed in the seemingly endless daylight, let's explore the land itself. Iceland is a place where the earth feels alive, constantly shifting and transforming beneath your feet. Volcanoes rumble deep inside the ground, sending ash and lava spilling across the landscape, while glaciers slowly crawl down from the mountains, carving valleys and fjords. The land is raw, untamed, and unforgiving, and yet it's beautiful, unlike any place you've ever seen before. The constant light, combined with Iceland's dramatic geography, creates an atmosphere that is both eerie and magnificent. The land feels as though it holds ancient secrets, waiting to be uncovered. The Vikings, when they first arrived on Iceland's shores, were faced with an environment that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. They had explored the coastlines of Norway, Denmark, and the British Isles, but nothing could have prepared them for the raw power and isolation of Iceland. It was a place where the land seemed to breathe with fire and ice, where every storm felt like nature's attempt to reclaim the earth, and where the sun's never-ending presence must have both bewildered and inspired them. But for the Vikings, Iceland was more than just a new home. It was a land that had to be conquered. They arrived as settlers, not just to build communities, but to carve their place into the very landscape itself. The rugged geography of Iceland presented unique challenges. There were no sprawling farmlands or gentle hills, but rather harsh volcanic terrain, snow-covered peaks, and wild, wind-swept coasts. Iceland was a land of extremes, and the Vikings had no choice but to adapt. At first, life here was difficult. Iceland's extreme climate and unpredictable weather patterns made farming and fishing hard. The Vikings had to work with the land rather than against it. They learned to build houses that could withstand the strong winds and freezing temperatures. They constructed long houses with thick walls, low ceilings, and steep roofs designed to trap warmth. The fire inside their homes was their most important ally. It provided heat, light, and a source of life in a place where survival was never guaranteed. The Vikings also learned to work with Iceland's volcanic landscape. They used the fertile soil left behind by eruptions to grow crops like barley, oats, and rye. They adapted to the harsh growing conditions, using the volcanic ash as a natural fertilizer that helped crops thrive. It was through this ingenuity and adaptability that the Vikings were able to survive and eventually thrive in Iceland's unforgiving environment. But it wasn't just farming that shaped the Vikings' relationship with the land. It was also their belief system. The Vikings viewed the land as a living, breathing entity, filled with spirits and gods that controlled the natural world. The harshness of Iceland, with its volcanic eruptions, snowstorms, and endless daylight, was seen as a reflection of the gods' power. The Vikings believed that nature itself was infused with divine energy, and their connection to the land was deeply spiritual. They saw the midnight sun as a symbol of the gods' eternal power, a light that never waned, that symbolized life and death, creation and destruction. In Viking mythology, Balder, the god of light and purity, was a central figure. His death and eventual rebirth were seen as a metaphor for the cycles of nature, the eternal dance between life and death, light and dark. Balder's myth held particular significance for the Vikings in Iceland, where the midnight sun blurs the boundaries between night and day. In a world where the sun never set, the story of Balder, who was both a symbol of light and purity and a figure whose death brought about an eventual renewal, resonated deeply with their daily experiences. The endless sun in Iceland mirrored the eternal radiance of Balder, while the harsh winters reflected the darker, more destructive aspects of the myth. The sun, which never set, became more than just a source of light. It became a presence, a force that guided the Vikings through their lives. It was their constant companion, shaping their daily routines, their rituals, and their relationship with the land. It was both a blessing and a challenge, just as Balder's radiance could both warm and burn. So too did the never-setting sun provide both opportunities and hardships for the Vikings. Imagine living under that perpetual glow. Imagine walking through the barren volcanic plains with the sun always hanging low in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows. The ground beneath your feet is alive with heat, the remnants of an ancient eruption still warming the earth, while above you the sky remains a bright, glowing canvas. It's a world where the passage of time becomes difficult to track, where the rhythms of life become disoriented, and where the light, unlike anything you've ever known, controls everything. For the Vikings, this constant daylight must have been both awe-inspiring and overwhelming. It was a reminder of nature's power, of the gods' dominance over the world, but it was also a challenge to their way of life. The endless sun provided no reprieve, no retreat from the harshness of the land. It demanded constant vigilance, constant activity, constant work. But even in the face of this relentless light, the Vikings found ways to thrive. They worked with the land, learning to grow food in the volcanic soil, adapting their houses and homes to withstand the harsh climate, and building a culture that celebrated both the light and the dark. The midnight sun was not just a curiosity, it was a force that shaped their very way of life, and it wasn't just the Vikings who were influenced by the midnight sun. The land itself, so raw, so untamed, so full of power, became a part of the Viking identity. Iceland was not just a place to settle, it was a place to conquer, to shape, and to call their own. It was a land that demanded respect, but also offered immense rewards to those who could adapt and survive. Through their ingenuity, resilience, and connection to the land, the Vikings turned Iceland into a home. They built their communities, their myths, and their stories around the very forces that shaped their world. The sun, the volcanoes, the glaciers, and the endless cycle of life and death. The midnight sun was both a gift and a challenge, a force that guided them and tested them. It illuminated their path, but it also demanded their endurance. The Vikings' relationship with Iceland was one of constant adaptation, innovation, and reverence for the forces of nature. They did not simply survive in this land, they thrived, building a culture that continues to inspire awe and admiration to this day. Iceland, with its harsh beauty and unrelenting light, became the cradle of Viking culture, shaping their stories, their beliefs, and their legacy for generations to come. The Vikings were not merely survivors in the land of the midnight sun. They were creators of a culture deeply intertwined with the forces of nature around them. Every aspect of their existence, from the food they ate to the gods they worshipped, was shaped by the light that never dimmed in the harsh conditions they lived under. As you walk through this land with them, you begin to understand how the constant sunlight affected not just their day-to-day survival, but their very worldview. For the Vikings, the midnight sun wasn't just an environmental oddity. It was a constant force, a companion, and a challenge that demanded respect and resilience. One of the most noticeable effects of the midnight sun on Viking life was the disruption of natural rhythms. Human beings by nature are governed by the cycle of day and night, by the rise and fall of the sun. This cycle determines when we wake, when we eat, and when we rest. It is a fundamental part of our biology. But in Iceland, the sun refused to follow these rules. The days stretched on endlessly, and nights faded into perpetual twilight. The internal clocks of the Vikings, so attuned to the rise and fall of the sun back home, were now off balance. Sleep became elusive, and rest was hard to find. They had no night to fall into, no darkness to bring the calming embrace of sleep. Instead, they lived in a world where the sun hovered just above the horizon, casting everything in a strange, ethereal glow. To cope with this, the Vikings developed ways to simulate night, to bring rest and respite to their minds and bodies. Thick woolen curtains were drawn across windows to block out the light, creating shadows and darkness inside their longhouses. They built fires that burned low, creating a warm, dim glow that mimicked the soothing embrace of nighttime. These man-made nights gave the Vikings the space they needed to rest and gather their strength, even as the world outside was flooded with golden light. Yet, despite their best efforts, the midnight sun remained a constant presence in their lives, a reminder of the challenges they faced in this strange new land. But the Vikings didn't just endure the endless daylight, they embraced it. They adapted their lives and their culture to fit this new world, finding ways to make the most of the unrelenting sun. With extended hours of daylight, they were able to hunt, fish, and farm for longer periods of time. The short Icelandic summer became less of a curse and more of an opportunity. They took advantage of the long days to work tirelessly, knowing that the more they accomplished in the summer, the more prepared they would be for the long, dark winter months ahead. It was during these endless days that the Vikings truly made their mark on Iceland. They built settlements, cultivated the land, and crafted tools that would help them survive in this harsh environment. They planted crops in the rich volcanic soil, using the sun's constant light to nurture their harvests. Barley, oats, and rye grew quickly in the long days, providing much-needed food to sustain them through the long winters. Even the animals they raised, cattle, sheep, and horses, thrived under the continuous light, growing stronger and more resilient as they adapted to the unique environment. But the midnight sun was not only a force that shaped their practical lives, it also played a significant role in their spirituality. The Vikings saw the natural world as imbued with the power of the gods, and the sun itself was a divine force. The endless daylight reflected the eternal presence of the gods, who were ever watchful and ever powerful. It was in this light that they found meaning in their lives. Balder, the god of light, was especially important to them, and his myths resonated deeply with the experience of living under the sun that never set. Balder's radiance, purity, and eventual death symbolized the endless cycle of life and death, light and dark, that the Vikings experienced on a daily basis. The sun's eternal presence became a reminder of Balder's strength and sacrifice, and the light that bathed the land was a reflection of his divine power. Yet, the sun's constant light was not without its darker side. The Vikings understood the power of the sun, but they also knew it could be dangerous. Just as the sun gave life, it could also burn and destroy. The harsh glare of the sun during the summer months could be overwhelming, and the extended daylight sometimes led to exhaustion and burnout. The Vikings, ever practical, learned to respect the sun's power, knowing that while it gave them life, it also demanded their attention and their caution. They could not afford to be complacent, for the sun's endless presence could wear down even the most resilient of warriors. In the longhouse, when the fire crackled and the light outside lingered well into the night, the Vikings would sit and reflect on the power of the sun. They would gather together, telling stories of the gods and the world they inhabited, stories of creation and destruction, of light and shadow. The midnight sun, in all its glory and danger, was woven into every tale, and as the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls, the Vikings knew that they were living in a world unlike any other, a world where the sun never set, and where every moment was shaped by its unyielding glow. The Viking experience in Iceland, with its constant daylight, was a profound one. It shaped their culture, their spirituality, and their very way of life. The midnight sun was a force they could not escape, but one they learned to live with. It became a part of them, just as it became a part of the land. And in the end, it was this deep connection to the sun and the land that allowed the Vikings to thrive in Iceland, creating a legacy that would endure for centuries. As you reflect on the life the Vikings led under the midnight sun, you begin to understand the incredible adaptability and resilience of these people. They did not simply survive in Iceland. They embraced the challenges of the land and the light, turning them into strengths. They made the most of every moment, living in a world where the sun never set and where the endless glow became both a gift and a challenge. It is in this land of fire and ice, light and dark, that the Vikings forged their culture, a culture shaped by the forces of nature, the gods, and the midnight sun. As the days stretched on beneath the never-setting sun, the Vikings found themselves not just surviving, but thriving, creating and molding a unique way of life that reflected their relentless adaptability. The landscape of Iceland, with its wild extremes, continued to shape them as they made it their home. But their relationship with time, marked by the absence of night, left its mark on every aspect of their lives. The midnight sun wasn't just a physical phenomenon, it became the very heart of their culture, influencing everything from their spiritual beliefs to their daily routines and even their most sacred rituals. Life here required resilience, creativity, and, perhaps most of all, a deep connection to the land and its strange light. The Vikings understood the cycles of nature better than most. They saw their world not as a random collection of elements, but as a living, breathing entity, a place where every rock, tree, and gust of wind had meaning. For them, everything was interconnected. The land, the sea, the air, and the sky, each part of the environment was infused with divine power. The gods walked among them, and the very essence of their existence was tied to the elements around them. This connection to nature made the Vikings particularly attuned to the rhythm of the world around them. Yet, when faced with the constant daylight of the midnight sun, they were forced to adapt. This wasn't just about figuring out how to sleep when the sun refused to set. It was about redefining what time itself meant. The lack of darkness disrupted not just their sleep cycles, but the way they marked the passage of days. It is here that the Vikings' ingenuity truly shone. In a world where day and night blended into one, The Vikings invented new ways to measure time. They became experts in tracking the seasons, using the position of the sun and the length of shadows as markers. The changing light throughout the day told them when to work, when to feast, and when to rest. Even though the sun refused to set, they found their rhythm within this endless glow. But as much as they relied on the sun to guide them, they also sought to create rituals that mimicked the night. Without the comforting darkness that most cultures had, they adapted by building sacred spaces and creating darkness through fire and fabric. These rituals weren't just practical, they were vital to their well-being, mentally and spiritually. The midnight sun brought more than just practical changes. It reshaped their very sense of identity. Time, work, and rest were no longer dictated by the same rules. Everything changed: how they worked the land, how they interacted with each other, how they worshipped their gods, and how they saw the world. Time in Iceland was no longer a linear progression. It was cyclical, dictated by the light that never stopped. In a way, the midnight sun gave them a unique understanding of the universe, one that blended time with nature in ways that other cultures couldn't have understood. But despite their efforts to mark time and live within the rhythms of the land, the Vikings weren't immune to the mental toll of the endless daylight. The human body, after all, was designed to work within the natural cycle of light and dark. The absence of night brought about a certain weariness. With no natural off switch for the mind, the Vikings found themselves struggling with exhaustion, sleeplessness, and a kind of mental disarray. Though they were able to adapt physically to the environment, the emotional strain was harder to cope with. This wasn't just about staying awake, it was about how the constant daylight affected their mental state. This struggle with sleeplessness and mental strain is hinted at in the old sagas, tales of warriors who fought valiantly in the daylight, but who were also haunted by their inability to rest. In these tales, the gods themselves are subject to this same challenge. Balder, the god of light, whose very essence was tied to the sun, faced his own challenges with the light that never dimmed. His eventual death at the hands of Loki, a death that brought darkness, symbolized the inevitable balance between light and dark. The Vikings, living under the endless daylight of Iceland, could not escape this cosmic tension. They lived in a world where the sun never set, but they also carried the weight of the need for balance, the need for rest, for darkness, for renewal. Balder's story, with its tragic ending, mirrored the Vikings' own struggle to find peace in a world where the light never left. Despite these challenges, the Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived. They created a culture that embraced the power of the sun, while also respecting its dangers. They found solace in rituals that marked the passage of time, in community gatherings where the warmth of the fire replaced the coolness of the night, and in the stories that tied them to their gods. The endless light was not just an inconvenience, it was a sacred force, a symbol of both life and death, strength and fragility. And while the midnight sun made life in Iceland uniquely challenging, it also provided the Vikings with an opportunity. It gave them extra time to work, to explore, to create. They were able to build thriving settlements in a land that would have seemed inhospitable to many. Iceland, with its volcanic soil and harsh climate, became a cradle of Viking civilization. The constant daylight, though a challenge, was also a gift. It allowed the Vikings to cultivate their land, raise their livestock, and create a community that could survive the harsh winters. The Vikings were deeply connected to the land of Iceland. They respected it, worshipped it, and molded their culture to it, their lives, their work, their beliefs. Everything was shaped by the forces of nature, especially the light that never dimmed. And it was in the midnight sun that they found both their greatest challenge and their greatest strength. As you walk through Iceland today, it's easy to see the traces of the Viking spirit. The same light that bathed them in its golden glow still shines, still shapes the landscape, still calls to the people of Iceland. The midnight sun, with all its power and beauty, continues to illuminate this land just as it did for the Vikings centuries ago. Their legacy, forged in the light that never set, continues to inspire and shape the culture of Iceland, reminding us of the resilience, ingenuity, and spirit of the people who once called this land home. As we continue to explore the profound effects of the midnight sun on Viking culture, it's impossible to ignore one of the most significant ways it impacted their worldview, their spirituality. For the Vikings, nature was far more than just a backdrop for their daily lives. It was infused with divine power. The land itself, the sun, the moon, and the seasons were all seen as manifestations of the gods' will. And in a world where the sun never dipped below the horizon, it was no surprise that their beliefs, their gods, and their very way of life were deeply entwined with this eternal light. The Vikings lived in a world where the natural forces around them were both a source of strength and danger. Their gods were representations of these forces of fire, of water, of light, and of darkness. Among the most important of these gods was Balder, the god of light, purity, and beauty. Balder was a figure of radiance, whose very existence symbolized the life-giving force of the sun. He was often depicted as the most beloved of the gods, radiant and pure, shining as a beacon of hope and vitality. For the Vikings, his light was sacred, embodying everything that was good and pure in the world. Balder's story, however, is not one of simple light. The myth of Balder is deeply intertwined with themes of death and rebirth, a narrative that speaks to the tension the Vikings felt living under the endless daylight of the midnight sun. As the sun shone relentlessly over Iceland, it mirrored Balder's eternal radiance, but it also held within it the potential for destruction. Balder's tragic death, brought about by the trickery of the mischievous god Loki, was a moment of profound darkness. His death was symbolic of the inevitable cycle of life and death, light and dark, that even the gods themselves could not escape. The story of Balder's death was more than just a tragic tale. It was a reflection of the harsh realities of life in Iceland. The Vikings lived in a world where the sun never set, but they also knew that darkness, both literal and metaphorical, was always lurking just beneath the surface. The harsh winters, the volcanic eruptions, the unpredictable weather, these were all reminders that the light could never be taken for granted. The death of Balder, in the context of the midnight sun, symbolized the necessary balance between light and darkness, between life and death. The Vikings, living in a land where the sun never set, understood the importance of this balance. They knew that just as the sun brought life, it could also bring destruction. The constant daylight may have been a source of strength and energy, but it was also a reminder of the dangers of imbalance. Just as Balder's death marked the temporary end of the light, the Vikings understood that the sun's power could not last forever. There would come a time when the light would fade, when the darkness would return. In this way, the midnight sun was both a blessing and a reminder of the fragile nature of life itself. The Vikings' connection to the sun, to Balder, and to the land around them was spiritual as much as it was practical. Their religious rituals were deeply tied to the cycles of nature, and the sun was at the center of their worship. It was not just a source of light and warmth, it was a sacred force, a divine presence that shaped their very existence. The Vikings saw the sun as a living, breathing entity, imbued with the power of the gods. It was the light that illuminated their world, but also the light that could lead them to destruction. Their worship of the sun was not just an acknowledgement of its power. It was a recognition of the cyclical nature of life, of the constant interplay between light and dark, life and death. In the long houses, the fires would burn late into the night, though there was no night, and the Vikings would gather together to honor their gods, to celebrate their victories, and to seek protection from the challenges of the world around them. The sun, even when it was relentless, was never taken for granted. The Vikings knew that their very existence depended on the delicate balance between light and dark. And as they told stories around the fire, they would remember the gods who governed these forces, especially Balder, whose light was both a gift and a reminder of the fragility of life. The midnight sun, in all its glory and mystery, became a symbol of the eternal cycle of life and death. The Vikings, who lived under its constant gaze, understood that light could not exist without darkness, just as day could not exist without night. The sun was a force to be revered, but also one to be feared. The gods, too, were part of this cycle, and the Vikings knew that just as Balder's light would return, so too would the darkness. But the story of the sun and the gods didn't just end with Balder's death. For the Vikings, the idea of eternal return was central to their belief system. They understood that the cycles of nature, the cycles of life and death, were eternal. The sun would set, but it would always rise again. The darkness would come, but it would always give way to light. In this way, the Vikings saw the midnight sun not just as a physical phenomenon, but as a symbol of the eternal struggle between light and dark, between life and death. It was a reminder that even in the face of eternal daylight, the balance of the universe must be maintained. As the endless daylight stretched on, the Vikings continued their work, their worship, and their storytelling. They built their homes, their communities, and their lives around the light that never set. But they did so with the understanding that the sun, like all things, could not last forever. They had come to respect the power of the sun, to see it not just as a source of warmth and life, but as a force that could bring destruction just as easily as it could bring light. The midnight sun, with its unyielding presence, shaped the Vikings' worldview. It was a light that never set, a light that demanded respect and reverence. It was the light of life, but also the light of death. A reminder that all things must come to an end. The Vikings understood this balance, and it shaped their culture, their myths, and their very understanding of the world. So as you sit here tonight, imagining the endless daylight that once bathed the Viking world, remember that the sun's eternal glow was both a blessing and a challenge. It shaped the Vikings' spirituality, their beliefs, and their way of life. And in that endless light, they found not just survival, but a profound connection to the gods, to nature, and to the very cycles of life itself. The endless daylight of Iceland wasn't just a challenge for the Vikings in terms of survival, it was also a catalyst for them to refine their unique skills in ways that would shape their society for generations to come. Their ability to adapt to this unusual phenomenon didn't stop at building darkened rooms or adjusting their daily rhythms. It extended to their most fundamental traits as seafarers, warriors, and explorers. It was a land where the days were long, but the winters could be merciless. The Vikings were experts at making the most of every minute they were given, working tirelessly, planning for the long months of cold, and stretching every moment of daylight to its fullest potential. With the midnight sun providing nearly constant hours of daylight, the Vikings' time on the seas and their expeditions to new lands became longer and more far-reaching. Iceland's isolation and harsh geography, paired with the never-ending daylight, gave the Vikings a clear advantage when it came to exploration. They could travel farther, hunt longer, and prepare more effectively for the winters that would soon fall upon them. The Vikings' navigational skills were legendary. They didn't rely on compasses or maps as we know them today. Instead, they learned to read the sun's position in the sky and the stars to navigate their journeys. With the sun hovering in the sky for so long during Iceland's summer, they had an unprecedented opportunity to master these skills, learning to navigate using the sun's constant light as a reliable guide. Without the darkness to obscure their paths, they could explore vast expanses of land and sea, pushing farther and farther from their homes. The Viking longships, nimble and fast, were perfectly designed to carry them through these long days, their sleek, powerful forms cutting through the water like knives. The ability to travel extensively during the day not only expanded their horizons, it gave them the capacity to engage in trade, establish alliances, and even conquer new territories. With such long days, the Vikings could stay on the move, covering distances that would have been impossible in places governed by shorter days. The long hours of daylight were a weapon in and of themselves, extending their ability to stay on the seas, to raid and to explore. In addition to their seafaring prowess, the Vikings were skilled hunters and fishers. The never-ending daylight allowed them to extend their time on the water, making the most of the summer season. Fishing boats stayed out longer, their nets hauling in the bounty of the sea as the sun continued its relentless circle overhead. Their keen sense of timing, honed by generations of living in rhythm with the land and the sea, made them the masters of survival in this harsh world. The extended daylight was more than just an extension of time for work, it was also an extension of their social activities. The Vikings were known for their love of feasts, celebrations, and gatherings. In a place where the sun never set, there was always time for another story, another song, another drink around the fire. The Vikings thrived on social interaction, and the never-ending daylight created the perfect environment for these gatherings to flourish. But it wasn't just work and celebration that defined the Vikings' relationship with the midnight sun. It was also their deep connection to their environment. Iceland's harsh beauty, the endless sky, the ever-present light, all combined to create a profound connection between the Vikings and the land. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature, they saw themselves as part of it. The land was their home, their provider, and their teacher. Living under the constant sun, the Vikings grew deeply attuned to the subtle changes in light, weather, and the landscape. As they navigated the harsh terrain of Iceland, they understood the power of the elements in ways that most of us can only imagine. They knew when the weather would change, when the seas would turn, and when it was time to set sail or stay anchored. They had an intrinsic connection to the natural world, one that had been honed over centuries of living in a place where the elements were both their greatest ally and their most formidable enemy. Their ability to adapt to the midnight sun was not just about surviving, it was about thriving. The long days allowed them to be more productive, more efficient, and more creative. They built longhouses that could withstand the harshest storms, cultivated the land with new techniques that utilized the volcanic soil, and developed the arts and crafts that would become symbols of their strength and resilience. They lived in a world where the sun never set, but instead of seeing that as a burden, they saw it as an opportunity to push the limits of what was possible. In fact, the very concept of time in Viking culture was fluid, shaped by the endless daylight and their need to be adaptable. Without the clear division between night and day, time became something to be shaped by their actions, by their needs, by the rhythms of their community and the land. They worked, they played, they worshipped, all in accordance with the sun's constant presence. They did not live in the strict framework that many of us adhere to today, where time is neatly segmented into hours and minutes. For the Vikings, time was something more organic, a cycle of activity, rest, and renewal that moved with the sun's unceasing journey across the sky. But even though the sun never set, the Vikings never lost their sense of urgency. They knew that while the days were long, the harsh winters would come, and they needed to prepare. The constant light of the summer months might have given them more time to work, but it also reminded them that they had to act quickly. The seasons were harsh and unforgiving, and they had to use every precious moment to prepare for the long, dark months ahead. The sun, in its eternal glow, provided them with the time they needed to stockpile food, build shelter, and ensure their survival through the winter. It wasn't just about survival, though it was about thriving, about making a mark on the world. As the sun hung in the sky, casting its golden light over the land, the Vikings continued to shape their communities, to expand their influence, and to create a legacy that would last for centuries. The Midnight Sun, while a challenging force, also gave them the tools they needed to create a world that was uniquely their own. A world shaped by light, darkness, and the relentless cycle of nature. And as the sun continued its eternal dance, the Vikings remained steadfast, driven by the light that illuminated their path. It was a light that never dimmed, a light that burned bright and strong, guiding them through the days and the nights, through the challenges and the triumphs. The midnight sun was more than just a natural phenomenon. It was a force that shaped their lives, their culture, and their identity. And in the end, it was the light of the midnight sun that became their greatest ally, their most trusted companion in the fight for survival, growth, and immortality. As the days stretch on beneath the midnight sun, the Vikings find themselves not just surviving but thriving, transforming the strange light of their environment into a force that shaped their very identity. They weren't just adapting to the land, they were creating a culture in tune with the land's pulse. Understanding that this perpetual daylight wasn't just a phenomenon to endure but something to be integrated into their worldview. They found meaning, beauty, and yes, struggle within the light's reach, forging a way of life uniquely their own. But as life under the constant daylight continued, it became clear that the world of the Vikings was inextricably linked to the land around them. Iceland's rugged, ever-changing landscape, its glaciers, volcanic peaks, fiery geysers, and deep fjords was as much a part of the Viking experience as the people themselves. It was a land that demanded respect, resilience, and resourcefulness. As the Vikings continued to build their homes, farms, and communities in Iceland, they realized that this landscape, shaped by the eternal presence of the sun, could provide for them but also challenge them in ways they had never experienced before. The Vikings, being the master navigators they were, found that their connection to the land was deepened by their mastery of the elements, especially the light. They knew that, with the right timing, they could take full advantage of the sun's constant presence. The unyielding daylight became more than just a challenge. It was a tool, a source of energy that they could harness to help them thrive. They relied on the light to extend their workdays, to grow crops that would sustain them through harsh winters, and to explore new territories that had once been beyond their reach, in a place where the days could last forever. The Vikings were not only concerned with survival, they were creating a legacy. This legacy wasn't just about surviving in a harsh, unforgiving land, but about thriving, expanding, and forging new paths. The ever-present light, which could have easily been a burden, became a symbol of their determination to rise above any obstacle. They used the light to push themselves further, working and living with an intensity that reflected the same power they saw in the gods they worshipped. But this drive to expand and conquer wasn't just limited to their practical lives. The very essence of their culture was transformed by the sun that never set. In their myths and legends, the gods were seen as representations of the forces of nature that controlled the world around them. And for the Vikings, the sun itself was not just a source of light but a living presence, a divine force that shaped everything in their world. This view of the sun as a divine force was reflected in their rituals, in their religious practices, and in their stories. The gods, too, lived in the light that was always present, always shining, always watching. The sun, in Viking belief, was both a force of creation and destruction. It was a giver of life, bringing warmth and light to the land, allowing crops to grow and animals to thrive. But the sun's power was not without its darker side. Just as the sun could bring life, it could also burn and destroy. The Vikings understood this balance, this duality, and it became a central part of their mythology. They knew that while the sun's light was a gift, it was also a force that had the power to scorch the earth and burn through everything in its path. This understanding of the sun's power was deeply rooted in their daily lives. As they worked under the endless glow, the Vikings would have felt both empowered and humbled by the sun's presence. It was a force they could not escape, but one they learned to live with. They built their homes to withstand the extremes, and their beliefs became intertwined with the cycles of nature. They celebrated the sun for its strength, but also recognized its potential for destruction. It was a relationship built on both reverence and caution. The gods themselves, particularly Balder, the god of light, were symbols of this balance. Balder's story, filled with themes of purity, light, and death, was a reflection of the eternal struggle between life and death, light and dark. Just as the Vikings lived in a world where the sun never set, they also lived in a world where darkness was always just around the corner, waiting to return. The death of Balder, brought about by the trickery of Loki, symbolized the inevitable return of darkness. But even in death, Balder was not gone forever. He would be reborn, just as the sun would return after the long winter. This cyclical nature of life, death and rebirth, was woven into the fabric of Viking life and beliefs, giving their culture a depth and resilience that allowed it to thrive in Iceland's harsh or ever-changing environment. The Vikings' relationship with the land and the sun wasn't just one of survival, it was one of reverence, of understanding that the forces of nature were both their greatest allies and their most formidable adversaries. They didn't just live with the midnight sun, they revered it, shaped their lives around it, and created a culture that reflected its power. The sun, in all its glory and danger, became a symbol of their strength, their resilience, and their connection to the world around them. This connection to the sun and the land was reflected in the Vikings' daily lives. The endless daylight wasn't just a practical challenge, it was a spiritual one as well. It made the Vikings deeply connected to the land, to the rhythms of nature, and to the gods who govern those rhythms. They knew that their lives, their work, and their survival were dependent on their ability to live in harmony with the forces around them. And yet, the midnight sun also brought its own set of challenges. The constant daylight meant that there was never a true rest period, no natural time to pause and recover. This led to mental and physical exhaustion, as the Vikings worked longer hours, pushing themselves harder than they had ever been pushed before. And yet, despite the toll this took on them, the Vikings continued to thrive. They were resilient, resourceful and determined, adapting to the challenges of the land and using the endless daylight to their advantage. As you imagine life under the midnight sun, you realize that it was a world of both opportunity and struggle. The sun's eternal glow allowed the Vikings to build their culture, expand their reach, and carve out a life in the harshest of environments. But it also demanded their endurance, their creativity, and their ability to adapt. The Vikings did not simply survive in Iceland, they transformed the endless daylight into a force that shaped their culture, their beliefs, and their identity. In the end, the Vikings' relationship with the midnight sun was a reflection of their resilience and strength. They didn't just live under the sun, they thrived in its light, building a culture that would endure for centuries. The light that never set became a symbol of their unyielding spirit, their connection to the land, and their ability to adapt and survive in a world that was constantly shifting and changing. As the Vikings grew accustomed to life under the midnight sun, their relationship with the land and the light became an intrinsic part of their identity. But beyond just survival, the light became a tool for their creativity, expression, and spirituality. The constant daylight, which had initially been a challenge, began to shape not only their work but also their art and culture. Under the sun's eternal glow, the Vikings crafted some of their most revered artistic masterpieces, pieces that still resonate today with their powerful symbolism and intricate beauty. While farming, hunting, and exploration were essential for survival, it was the arts that allowed the Vikings to leave a lasting mark on the world. Their ability to create art, whether through runic inscriptions, intricate jewelry, or beautifully designed ships, was not simply a way to pass the time. It was a way to connect with their gods, their ancestors, and with the very land they had made their home. The presence of the midnight sun allowed them the time and energy to dedicate to the craft of storytelling and artistry. When the sun refused to set, the Vikings could labor by its light, creating artifacts and works of art that would echo throughout the ages. One of the most significant forms of Viking art was their intricate carvings and runic inscriptions. These carvings, often found on stones, weapons, and longhouses, were more than just decorative. They were sacred. The Vikings believed that the runes held great power, connecting them to the gods and to the ancient spirits of the land. These symbols, often inscribed with reverence under the watchful gaze of the sun, were used to mark important events, declare victories, and honor their gods. The creation of these works was not just about leaving a legacy, but about connecting the physical world with the spiritual one. The carvings were symbols of both strength and spirituality, created in a land where light and darkness were forever intertwined. Jewelry, too, played a significant role in Viking culture. Viking artisans were skilled at crafting beautiful pieces from gold, silver, and iron, often decorated with intricate designs that mirrored the natural world around them. Animal motifs were common: wolves, bears, and ravens, each symbolizing strength, protection, or connection to the gods. These pieces were not just ornamental, they were imbued with meaning, representing the Viking warriors' connection to the divine forces they believed controlled the world. The endless daylight gave the Vikings ample time to craft these pieces, using the long hours of sunlight to pour their energy and craftsmanship into creating objects that had both beauty and power. But it wasn't just material goods that were created during the long hours of daylight. The Vikings were master storytellers, and under the endless sun, they had the time to share their most treasured myths and sagas. Storytelling was a way to pass down history, to honor the gods, and to remind the people of the eternal forces that shaped their lives. As the sun hung in the sky, casting its golden light over the longhouses, the Vikings gathered to hear tales of their ancestors, of great battles, and of gods who controlled the forces of nature. The sagas, written down centuries later, are some of the most valuable records we have of Viking life. They tell of gods and mortals, of heroes and villains, and of the complex relationships between the forces of light and darkness. The midnight sun, with its endless light, took on great significance in these stories. The gods, who were often depicted as both powerful and flawed, were seen as reflections of the forces that governed the natural world. The sun, with its relentless light, was both a blessing and a challenge. Much like the gods themselves, the presence of the midnight sun in Viking stories was not just symbolic. It was a constant reminder of the world the Vikings inhabited. The sun was a living, breathing force that shaped their daily lives. Its light was a source of both power and vulnerability. The light never let them rest, never gave them the comfort of darkness. But it was also a source of life, of warmth, of strength, just like the gods. The sun had a dual nature. It could bring both life and destruction. And in the Vikings' mythology, this duality was reflected in their understanding of the natural world. As the long days passed under the sun, the Vikings looked to the heavens for guidance. Their gods, particularly those associated with light and the sun, were deeply connected to the land they lived on. These gods were not distant or abstract. They were as present and powerful as the sun itself. Balder, the god of light, was particularly revered, as his story symbolized both the brilliance of the sun and the inevitability of its eventual decline. The death of Balder was a reminder that light, no matter how constant, could be extinguished, and darkness would eventually return. This knowledge was woven into the Vikings' understanding of the world. Even as the sun bathed them in its eternal glow, they knew that the darkness would always return. The cycles of light and dark, life and death were at the heart of Viking mythology. The midnight sun, with its unyielding light, symbolized the eternal struggle between these forces. The Viking stories were not just about gods and heroes. They were about the forces that shaped their world, the same forces that they saw reflected in the natural world around them. The sun was a constant, a reminder of the power that could both sustain and destroy. But as much as the sun was a powerful force, the Vikings understood that it wasn't just the light that defined their world. It was also the darkness, the long winters, the fierce storms, and the cold nights that gave meaning to the light. The two were inseparable. Without darkness, there could be no light. Without the sun, there could be no moon. And in the Viking worldview, this balance between light and dark was sacred. It was a reminder of the cycles that governed all things life, death, and rebirth. And the Vikings, living under the constant gaze of the midnight sun, understood that balance better than anyone. They lived in a world where the sun never set, but they also knew that the balance between light and dark was always shifting, always in flux. They embraced the light, but they also respected the darkness. And in this delicate balance, they created a culture that was both resilient and adaptable, one that could thrive in the endless daylight of Iceland, while also honoring the forces of nature that they could never fully control. As the sun set just for a brief moment before rising again, the Vikings would gather once more, continuing their eternal dance with the light. They would share their stories, their triumphs, and their struggles. And in the light that never went away, they found both their power and their peace. The midnight sun was their companion, their challenge, and their gift, a force that shaped their lives and their legacy for centuries to come. As the seasons changed, so did the way the Vikings interacted with the land and the sun. The midnight sun was not just a summer phenomenon, it was a permanent fixture that dominated their lives for months. dictating not only their daily routines but also their entire worldview. The prolonged daylight hours of the summer months allowed them to push beyond the physical limitations of normal life. But this constant sunlight also marked the passage of time in a way that most cultures couldn't comprehend. The Vikings knew that their lives, while governed by the sun, were also dictated by the harsh winters that lay just ahead. They worked long hours, aware that every moment of daylight was precious. The arrival of the summer solstice brought with it not just celebration but a sense of urgency. The long days meant they had limited time to prepare for the months of darkness that would inevitably follow. The Vikings' understanding of time was more practical than philosophical. They viewed the long days of summer as a window of opportunity. The sun's eternal presence was both a blessing and a reminder of the cold, dark days to come. In the years they spent in Iceland, the Vikings learned to make the most of the midnight sun. As the summer sun bathed the land, they planted crops, fished, hunted, and expanded their settlements. The absence of darkness meant they could work around the clock, but it also meant they had to prepare for the long, dark winters ahead. The Vikings, always pragmatic, knew that their survival depended on their ability to prepare in advance. The connection between the land and the sun was undeniable. The land of Iceland, with its volcanic soil, rugged mountains, and glaciers, was a place that required adaptation and resourcefulness. The constant light allowed the Vikings to maximize their agricultural production, creating fields of barley and rye that would nourish them through the long winters. They knew that, in the end, the land would provide only if they worked in harmony with its rhythms. One of the most profound impacts of the midnight sun on Viking life was its effect on their spirituality. The Vikings were deeply spiritual people, and their beliefs were rooted in a connection to nature and the gods. They saw the world as a reflection of divine forces. The sun, the moon, the winds, and the stars were all manifestations of the gods' power. The light that bathed their world was sacred, and they revered it with awe and respect. The worship of Balder, the god of light, was central to Viking spiritual life. Balder was the radiant god, the shining symbol of purity and goodness. He was the light in the darkness, the embodiment of hope and renewal. His myths were closely tied to the sun, and the Vikings, living under the constant light, saw Balder as a direct reflection of their world. The sun, with its eternal presence, was not just a physical entity, it was a divine force, one that governed their world and their destiny. Balder's death was a pivotal moment in Viking mythology. The god of light, who had once shone so brightly, was killed by the trickery of Loki. His death marked the beginning of darkness and winter, a reminder that even the brightest light can be extinguished. The Vikings' understanding of the midnight sun was shaped by this myth. The light that never set was not permanent. Darkness would come, and with it, the return of balance. The absence of night in the summer months mirrored the radiant presence of Balder. But it also reminded the Vikings of the inevitability of winter. The long daylight hours gave way to the cold, dark nights of winter, just as Balder's death led to the return of darkness. For the Vikings, this cycle was sacred. They understood that the sun's endless light was both a gift and a challenge, a reminder of the balance between light and dark. Life and death, as they worked, hunted, and fished under the eternal glow. The Vikings were not just surviving, they were creating a cultural legacy that would endure for centuries. The midnight sun shaped their identity in ways that can still be felt in modern Iceland. Their connection to the land, to the sun, and to the gods shaped their art, their spirituality, and their way of life. The Vikings' legacy is not just one of exploration and conquest, it is one of adaptation, resilience, and reverence for the forces of nature. The midnight sun, which once seemed like an overwhelming challenge, became a powerful symbol of their ability to thrive in the face of adversity. It was a light that never faded, a force that illuminated their path and guided them through their struggles. As the Vikings looked to the future, they knew that their connection to the land and the sun would continue to shape their destiny. They had learned to live in harmony with the forces of nature, to embrace both the light and the darkness. The midnight sun, in all its power and majesty, was both their companion and their guide. And in that light, they found the strength to build, to grow, and to create a legacy that would last for generations. The Vikings, under the watchful eye of the sun, built their world. They transformed Iceland's rugged terrain into a place of thriving communities, a place where their culture, their beliefs, and their stories could live on. The light that never set shaped them, molded them, and allowed them to create a legacy that continues to echo through the land today. As we step deeper into the story of the Vikings and their relationship with the midnight sun, we begin to understand that their resilience wasn't just about surviving the physical challenges of the land. It was also about embracing the spiritual dimensions of their existence. Iceland's harsh, ever-changing environment demanded constant adaptation, but it also offered opportunities for reflection, growth, and connection with the divine. The Vikings lived in a world where the boundaries between the natural and spiritual worlds were often blurred, and the sun, both its radiant presence and its eventual decline, played a central role in shaping their beliefs. The Vikings saw the sun not just as a physical source of light and warmth, but as a divine presence that governed the cycles of life. They believed that the sun was imbued with the power of the gods, and its eternal presence in the summer months was a reflection of their god's unyielding influence over the world. Balder, the god of light, was the embodiment of this divine power. His light was not just a source of warmth, it was a symbol of purity, hope, and renewal. His radiance, much like the midnight sun, was unbroken, shining brightly across the land and reminding the Vikings of the divine forces that shaped their lives. But just as the midnight sun brought endless light, it also brought with it an inevitable shadow. The myth of Balder's death is one of the most powerful in Viking mythology, symbolizing the delicate balance between light and darkness. Balder, whose light shone so brightly, was killed by the trickery of Loki, and his death marked the return of darkness. The sun, which had once hung low in the sky, never setting, would eventually give way to winter's cold and dark months. The eternal daylight of the midnight sun was a reminder of the fragile nature of life, of the inevitability of change, and of the cyclical nature of time itself. For the Vikings, the story of Balder's death was more than just a tale of a god's demise, it was a reflection of their own struggles. The constant daylight was a gift, but it was also a reminder that life, like the sun, could not remain in its golden glow forever. Darkness would come, just as winter followed summer, and with it the need to endure, to persevere, and to face the challenges that life would bring. In this way, the midnight sun mirrored the very essence of Viking existence. They thrived in the light, but they knew that the light could not last forever. As the Vikings lived under the midnight sun, their understanding of time shifted. Unlike cultures where the night served as a natural divider, Iceland's endless daylight blurred the lines between day and night, creating a sense of timelessness. The Vikings, ever adaptable, found ways to navigate this new world. They built their daily lives around the sun, using its constant presence as a guide for their work, their rituals, and their rest. But even in a land where the sun never set, they knew the value of balance. The endless days were both a blessing and a challenge, and the Vikings found ways to honor both the light and the darkness. In their myths, the gods were not separate from the world. They were part of the land, the sea, and the sky. The Vikings believed that their gods walked among them, guiding their actions, shaping their destinies, and influencing the very forces of nature. The sun, with its eternal light, was a symbol of the gods' power. The Vikings understood that the sun's light was not just a physical phenomenon, it was a divine force that governed the rhythms of the world. The gods, including Balder, were reflections of this power, and the Vikings' connection to the land and the sun was a reflection of their connection to the divine. As you imagine the Vikings' world, you can almost feel the weight of their beliefs. The sun, never setting, was a constant reminder of the divine. It was a light that illuminated their path, guiding them through their work and their worship. But it was also a light that demanded respect. The Vikings understood that the sun's eternal glow was both a gift and a challenge, and their spirituality was shaped by their understanding of this duality. In the longhouses, the Vikings gathered around fires, their faces illuminated by the warm, flickering glow. The endless light outside the longhouse may have been disorienting at times, but inside, the fire created a space for rest, reflection, and connection. The longhouse was a sacred space, a place where the Vikings could gather to honor their gods, share stories, and find solace in the warmth of the fire. It was here, under the shelter of the longhouse, that the Vikings could find balance in a world that was constantly changing. The fire was their anchor, their connection to the earth, and their source of light in the midst of the never-setting sun. But as much as the sun shaped their world, the Vikings also understood the need for darkness. The absence of night was both a blessing and a curse. While the endless daylight allowed them to accomplish more, it also made it harder to find rest, to recharge, and to find inner peace. The Vikings, who had spent centuries living with the cycles of light and dark, now had to create their own balance. They did this through rituals, through community, and through their deep connection to the gods. The midnight sun, for all its beauty and power, was not a force to be taken lightly. It demanded that the Vikings adapt, that they find new ways to live in harmony with the land, the sun, and the gods. The endless days were a gift, but they were also a reminder of the cycles of life and death that governed the world. The Vikings understood that the sun's eternal glow was not a guarantee, it was a force that could be both nurturing and destructive. And in the end, it was this understanding of the sun's power and the way they shaped their lives around it that allowed the Vikings to thrive in Iceland's harsh, ever-changing environment. In the quiet of the longhouse, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the never-ending daylight outside, the Vikings knew that their world was one of balance. The sun, the light, the darkness, they were all part of a greater cycle that governed their lives. They understood that life, like the sun, could not remain in one place forever. It would rise, it would set, and it would rise again. And in that endless cycle, the Vikings found their strength, their resilience, and their connection to the divine forces that shaped their world. With the midnight sun casting its never-ending glow, the Vikings not only survived but thrived, creating a world that reflected the duality of light and darkness that defined their lives. As we explore deeper into Viking culture, it becomes clear that their understanding of the world was rooted in an intricate web of beliefs, customs, and practices, each one shaped by their connection to the land and the forces that governed it. The sun's eternal presence had a profound effect on their spirituality, their art, and their way of life. offering them both opportunities and challenges that no other culture could truly comprehend. The Vikings were, at their core, seafarers and explorers. Their longships, sleek and fast, were the perfect vessels for navigating the rough seas, and the endless daylight during the summer months gave them more time to chart new territories, raid, and trade. The seas were their domain, and the sun's constant presence gave them the advantage of longer days, extending their time on the water. For the Vikings, the midday sun was not only a practical force, it also became a symbol of their ability to push the boundaries of what was possible. But as much as the midnight sun offered opportunities for exploration, it also forced the Vikings to reconsider their relationship with the land. Iceland was not just a place to settle, it was a place that demanded respect. The harsh, volcanic landscape, with its rocky terrain, fjords, and glaciers, was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. The constant daylight allowed the Vikings to explore the land more extensively, but it also meant that they were constantly working, constantly adapting to their environment, constantly looking for new ways to survive in a world that didn't provide the usual natural cycles of day and night. To survive in this environment, the Vikings had to be resourceful. They learned to harness the power of the land, making use of volcanic soil to grow crops, using the constant daylight to extend the growing season, and learning to fish and hunt with precision. In a world where every minute of daylight counted, the Vikings became experts in maximizing their time. But this wasn't just about survival. It was about creating something lasting. The Vikings didn't just adapt to Iceland, they shaped it. They didn't just survive under the midnight sun, they thrived, building settlements, growing crops, and establishing a way of life that reflected their connection to both the land and the divine forces they believed governed it. The connection between the Vikings and the land was not just practical, it was spiritual. The Vikings believed that their gods were intimately connected to the land and the forces that shaped it. The midnight sun, with its constant, unyielding glow, was not just a physical phenomenon, it was a divine force that governed the cycles of life. For the Vikings, the sun was a reflection of the gods themselves, and it was their belief in these divine forces that shaped their understanding of the world. In the sagas, the gods were not distant or abstract, they were active participants in the lives of the Vikings. They walked among them, guiding their actions, influencing their fates, and shaping the very world they inhabited. The sun, with its never-setting glow, was a symbol of their god's power. The Vikings believed that the sun was imbued with divine energy, and the endless daylight was a reflection of the god's eternal presence in the world. The midnight sun, for all its beauty and wonder, was also a reminder of the gods' power over the world, how they could provide light, but also take it away. The relationship between the Vikings and the sun was also reflected in their stories. In many ways, the sun was a character in the myths and legends they shared around the fire. The gods, particularly Balder, were seen as representations of the sun's eternal glow. Balder, the god of light, was revered not only for his beauty and radiance, but also for the balance he represented. His light was pure, but his story was also one of sacrifice, death, and eventual resurrection. Balder's death, brought about by Loki's trickery, marked the return of darkness, a necessary cycle that the Vikings understood. The death of Balder, in many ways, mirrored the endless cycle of day and night. The light could not last forever. Darkness would eventually come, and with it, the promise of renewal. This understanding of the light and its inevitable retreat was central to Viking spirituality. It was a belief that light, no matter how powerful, could never exist without darkness. And just as the sun would eventually set, so too would life give way to death. The Vikings understood that the sun's constant glow was a gift, but it was also a reminder of life's impermanence. Their beliefs about light and darkness, life and death were woven into every aspect of their culture, from their art to their rituals to their daily lives. As we continue to look at the Viking world under the midnight sun, we begin to understand how deeply their beliefs were intertwined with the land around them. The sun was both a symbol of life and a reminder of the impermanence of all things. The Vikings' connection to the land was not just about survival. It was about understanding their place in the larger cosmic cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The endless daylight of the midnight sun was a gift, but it was also a challenge, a reminder of the forces of nature that shaped their world. And yet, even with the challenges of living under the midnight sun, the Vikings embraced their world with open arms. They didn't see the endless daylight as a burden. They saw it as an opportunity to thrive, to grow, to build, and to explore. The sun that never set became a part of who they were, a symbol of their strength, resilience, and adaptability. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the Vikings could rise above, shaping their world to reflect their own power and spirit. In the longhouses where the light of the sun filtered through the windows, the Vikings continued to share their stories, their beliefs, and their dreams. The midnight sun, with its endless glow, became a part of their legacy, a force that guided them, shaped them, and allowed them to build a culture that would endure for centuries. The light, both a blessing and a challenge, would always be with them, just as their gods would always be watching over them. As we step further into the world of the Vikings, living under the midnight sun, we begin to explore how this unique light not only shaped their daily lives, but their very philosophy of existence. The endless daylight offered them countless opportunities for labor, exploration, and creation, but it also presented a deeper, almost existential challenge. The Vikings did not view the world solely through a lens of survival. They saw it through a lens of action, energy, and transformation. To them, every minute of daylight mattered, every hour was precious, and every day under the sun was an opportunity to shape the future. Living under the midnight sun forced the Vikings to confront a paradox. They lived in an environment where the boundaries between day and night were erased, where time itself became a fluid concept, and yet they were driven by the need to control time. The idea of time in Viking society was not static or mechanical, it was dynamic, driven by necessity, spiritual belief, and the ever-present sun. Time became something to be utilized, maximized, and revered. The Vikings were keenly aware that their time on Earth was finite, despite the illusion of the never-setting sun. They worked tirelessly under the sun's golden light, but they also had a profound understanding of the value of cycles, the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. The eternal daylight, to them, was not just a blessing, but a reminder that all things, even light, must eventually fade. And in this fading, there would be renewal. The contrast between the never-setting sun and the long winters was a reflection of the cycles of nature that governed their very existence. Their worldview was deeply influenced by this constant light, as well as by the eventual return of darkness. While the Vikings used the unbroken daylight to expand their world, they also prepared for the inevitable retreat of the light, just as they had prepared for the harsh Icelandic winters. The ability to adapt to the cycles of light and dark allowed them to thrive, even in the face of conditions that might have defeated others. They understood that survival meant more than just physical endurance. It meant understanding, respecting, and adapting to the rhythms of nature. In their spiritual beliefs, these rhythms were mirrored in the stories of their gods. The gods, too, were bound to the cycles of light and dark, life and death. The story of Balder, the god of light, was central to Viking spirituality, as it was a story of both radiance and demise. Balder, who was so beloved, died at the hands of Loki, and his death was the catalyst for a deeper understanding of balance. For the Vikings, the midnight sun, with its relentless shine, symbolized the eternal presence of life, but it also symbolized the inevitable return of darkness, and with it, the renewal of life in its fullest form. Balder's death was not the end, it was a promise of what would come. His death was a necessary part of the cycle, and just as the sun would eventually set and return, so too would life be reborn. The Vikings understood that time was cyclical, and this belief was reflected in every aspect of their lives. The midnight sun, with its unyielding presence, reminded them that everything, no matter how eternal it seemed, would eventually fade and give way to new life. This understanding, born from their connection to the land, the sun, and the gods, was central to their identity. In the longhouses, the flickering light of the fire was often the only break from the constant daylight outside. These longhouses, built to withstand the elements, became more than just shelters. They were sacred spaces, places where the Vikings could connect with the divine forces that governed their world. The fire, which burned brightly in the center of the longhouse, became a symbol of warmth, life, and connection to the gods. It was in the glow of the fire that the Vikings gathered, shared their stories, and celebrated their victories and defeats. The light of the fire, much like the light of the sun, was a reminder of the cycle of life and the eternal connection between all things. But as much as the Vikings revered the light, they also respected the darkness. The arrival of the long Icelandic winters, when the sun would dip below the horizon and the nights would stretch on for months, was a time of introspection, of preparation, and of renewal. The darkness was not something to fear, it was something to embrace, to use as a time for rest, reflection, and spiritual growth. The darkness allowed the Vikings to pause, to reflect on the year that had passed, and to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. The eternal light of summer could not last forever, and the Vikings understood that the darkness was just as vital to their existence as the sun. The long winters were not just a physical reality, they were a spiritual one as well. It was during the long, dark nights that the Vikings turned inward, that they connected with their ancestors and their gods, seeking guidance and wisdom. The cycles of light and dark were not just forces of nature, they were reflections of the cycles of life itself. The Vikings' connection to these cycles allowed them to find meaning in both the light and the dark, to see beauty in the endless summer as well as in the long, quiet winters. In the quiet of the longhouse, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the eternal daylight outside, the Vikings knew that their survival wasn't just about conquering the land. It was about understanding and living in harmony with the cycles of nature. The sun, which never set, became a symbol of their strength and resilience. It was both their challenge and their gift. The darkness, which would eventually return, was not something to fear but to embrace. The balance between light and dark, life and death, was sacred, and the Vikings knew that only by respecting this balance could they continue to thrive. The Vikings' ability to adapt to the midnight sun, to embrace both the light and the darkness, became a defining trait of their culture. They did not just endure the sun's eternal glow, they shaped their lives around it, weaving it into their stories, their beliefs, and their very way of being. And in this connection to the sun, to the gods, and to the land, the Vikings created a legacy that would endure for centuries, a legacy of resilience, strength, and spiritual depth that continues to inspire and captivate to this day. As we near the final chapters of our exploration into the world of the Vikings under the midnight sun, we reflect on the lasting impact this phenomenon had on their culture, spirituality, and legacy. The endless daylight was not just a physical reality, it shaped their very identity, creating a society that was as complex as it was resilient. The relentless sun pushed the Vikings to adapt in ways that still resonate today, and their ability to live harmoniously with the land, gods, and cycles of light and dark became the foundation for a culture that thrived against the odds. The Vikings' relationship with the sun was defined by their spirituality. The sun was not just a celestial object, it was a divine force, a reflection of the gods' power, an eternal light that guided and protected them. But while they revered the sun for its power to give life, the Vikings also understood that all life must follow a natural cycle, a cycle of light and darkness, of creation and destruction. This belief was reflected not only in their worship of the gods, but also in their acceptance of the inevitable cycles of nature that governed their world. Balder, the god of light, was central to their understanding of the sun and its relationship to the land. His myth told of both the brilliance of life and the inevitability of death, of light's eternal presence and the darkness that would one day return. The Vikings, living under the sun's constant gaze, understood this duality intimately. Their world was governed by light, but they knew that the light would eventually give way to darkness. This balance was sacred, and it was this understanding of balance that allowed the Vikings to thrive in the harsh and unpredictable environment of Iceland. In the constant daylight, the Vikings built their homes, their communities, and their way of life. They adapted to the land, using the extended sunlight to grow crops, raise livestock, and build their settlements. But the land itself was not just a source of sustenance, it was sacred, and it was intertwined with their spirituality. The sun, the earth, and the gods were all part of the same cosmic order, and the Vikings lived with a deep respect for these forces. They understood that their survival depended not just on their physical strength, but on their ability to live in harmony with the world around them. And so, in the endless glow of the midnight sun, the Vikings worked, prayed, and celebrated. They honored their gods, shared stories around the fire, and prepared for the harsh winters that would inevitably follow the endless days. The sun, though constant, was never taken for granted. The Vikings knew that its light was a gift, but also a reminder of the inevitable cycles that governed their world. The sun's eternal presence was a blessing, but it also came with a responsibility to honor and respect the land, the gods, and the natural rhythms of life. The storytelling traditions of the Vikings played an essential role in connecting them to the land, the sun, and the divine forces that governed their lives. These stories, passed down through generations, were more than just tales. They were a way to understand the world, to make sense of the forces of nature, and to honor the gods. The midnight sun, with its constant light, was woven into these stories, giving them depth and meaning. The sun's eternal glow became a metaphor for the cycle of life, a symbol of hope and renewal, but also a reminder of the fragility of life. In the longhouses where families gathered to tell stories and share in the warmth of the fire, the Vikings were reminded of the connection between the light and the dark. The sun may have shone brightly outside, but inside, the shadows of the longhouse served as a reminder of the balance that was necessary for survival. The warmth of the fire, the light that flickered within, was a symbol of the comfort and security that the Vikings sought in the face of the unyielding sun. It was here, in the flickering light of the fire, that the Vikings could find respite from the relentless daylight and connect with each other, their ancestors, and their gods. The Vikings' deep connection to the land and the light was not just a matter of survival, it was a matter of identity. They understood that the midnight sun, with all its beauty and power, was both a blessing and a challenge. It was a reminder of the cycles that govern their lives and the importance of balance. The Vikings did not just live under the sun, they built their culture, their stories, and their beliefs around it. They shaped their identity through their relationship with the land, the gods, and the sun itself, and as the sun would eventually set, giving way to the long, dark winters, the Vikings would embrace the darkness as a necessary part of the cycle. They would prepare for the return of the sun, knowing that the light would come again. The midnight sun, with its endless glow, was not a permanent state. It was a reminder that all things must come to an end, but also that life would return, just as the sun would rise again after the winter's darkness. In the end, the story of the Vikings under the midnight sun is one of resilience, adaptation, and balance. It is a story of a people who lived in harmony with the land and the forces of nature, who respected the power of the sun, but also understood its limitations. The Vikings didn't just survive under the unyielding light, they thrived. They built a culture that reflected their understanding of life's cycles, a culture that would endure for centuries. Long after the last Viking longship sailed from the shores of Iceland, as you reflect on the story of the Vikings, living under the eternal light, you realize that their legacy is not just about raiding and exploration, it's about understanding the rhythms of life, adapting to the forces that shape our world, and finding meaning in the cycles of light and dark. The midnight sun, both a challenge and a gift, shaped the Vikings' culture, their spirituality, and their very identity. And in the end, it is this deep connection to the land and the light that has left a lasting impact on the world today. As we arrive at the final part of our journey through the world of the Vikings and the midnight sun, we reflect on the profound way this unique phenomenon shaped not just their daily lives, but their cultural, spiritual, and existential beliefs. The relentless daylight that bathed Iceland during the summer months was more than just an environmental fact.